after his early 20s, when he tried to be a teacher and wasn't really successful, and social order was breaking down, he decided the best way to proceed was to set up a revolutionary bandit force in the hills of China where he was living. And with an armed squad of killers and thugs, most of them criminals, he then went around and terrorized the local villages for, initially in a small area, like the size of La Creuse, but then a bigger area and then a bigger one. And he did it in the name of Marxism because nobody read Marx, didn't know what he was talking about. It sounded impressive. And it had a basic message of revolutionary destructivism that he could then use. And the idea of class struggle meant that he would go to a village and round up the richest peasants and have them killed in front of the other peasants to deter them. And he got away with it. Now, and then he, next time he went to a village, he repeated this and gradually got a name. That guy is serious trouble. He's a serious revolutionary. Now, the Kuomintang tried to suppress this because to them it was just banditry, and they sent forces against him. But he was always sneaky and would flee when they sent an army. That's when the Long March happened. They sent an army to track him down in his bandit lairs, and he just took off. I learned from the biography he didn't walk on this long march, this heroic thing. He was carried the whole way. And he was using terror tactics against any peasants that opposed him or people that didn't accept his absolute authority. So there's a kind of megalomania going on here. And, I mean, obviously he's not the first political leader in history to suffer from megalomania. A lot of them do. My question really is, my mother was a Marxist, but she never would have agreed. She knew nothing about all this stuff. She was one of those romantic Cambridge, London University types that didn't want to even look at the horrors that Marxism was doing, hadn't got a clue. And he was very skillful at covering his tracks. Anyway, fast forward. He then wanted to get the atomic bomb, having defeated the Kuomintang in the Civil War by skillful military aid coming from Russia. He used his Soviet links to bring in arms which enabled them to defeat the nationalists. And then there was a fatal time, which I learned from the biography. The nationalists had amassed a huge army to track him down in his lair in the north when he ended up after the Long March. And they had enough forces to defeat him in battle. What Mao did was he invited the American ambassador to come and put on a show to America, saying, we're great, we're the real Democrats, we oppose Japan, we're on your side. We the communists are the real people you ought to deal with in China. Forget those nationalist types. They're just, not important. And they massaged the visit, and the American ambassador chap was utterly brainwashed. And it ended that Roosevelt then said, we'll support the Maoists and ignore the nationalists, and gave them aid and made it such that the nationalists were not able to win that crucial campaign. They lost it because of American aid. So this is ironic, isn't it, that America got Mao off the hook at a critical juncture in history. It's not the first time that one finds American foreign policy a bit wanting in its intelligence. We'll come to that in a minute. So yes, so Maoism has been pretty much an unbridled disaster. And then it had a moment of, it was seen off after the Gang of Four, the Cultural Revolution. Its successes became obvious to intelligent Chinese people, and Deng Xiaoping and others, they moderated it, and they re-enabled Confucianism to be taught once again in China. They rehabilitated some of the victims of the Cultural Revolution. And when I read about what happened, I mean, it is shocking what the extreme Maoists did. And as a teacher, I mean, they humiliated their teachers, most of whom were elderly and Confucianist, and they made them walk barefoot on glass in front of all the students, and they made them wear dunces hats, and then they killed them. They also used political cannibalism, which I think is absolutely over the top. So and they used this against Tibet, the Maoists did, attacking a Tibetan village and then not just killing the head man of the Tibetan resistance, but actually tearing out his liver and eating it, roasting it in front of all the peasant villagers and saying, this is what we do to people that stand up against us. And that's been documented historically. The use of political cannibalism, which also happened, by the way, in Cambodia, as a gesture of war and humiliation, I find utterly appalling. I can't believe that, that Marx would accept that that's a good thing to do, even if you do it in the name of revolution. It's a complete inversion of morality. Yes, and then the other thing I want to say briefly about Southeast Asian Marxism, which it shed the whole thing in a different light. Read this biography of Pol Pot, and his influence here in France was important. He liked the French intellectual scene. He liked to mingle in the Paris cafes and pretend to be one. But when he went home, he threw it all away and said, no, I'm going to bring in Cambodian communism my way. And he himself he knew more about Marxism than Mao, but he said, no, we're not going to follow either the Chinese path or the European communist route or the Russian. We're going to do it our way. And apparently in Cambodian culture, revenge killings and ritual humiliation was the counterside to very polite Buddhist smiling. Everyone's dispassionate and non-violent. And it seems to me there's this extreme flip goes on in Cambodian culture and Southeast Asian. On the one hand, the veneer is very Buddhist, very polite, very self-effacing. But then, as experts who study this say, when they flip over the top, and you get things like political cannibalism happening. And Pol Pot, he flipped and led to the deaths of some 2 million Cambodians in what's called the killing fields, because he wanted to begin society again. And that was an apocalyptic vision of going back to year zero and just killing off anyone that opposed him and starting again. I suppose it's one way of doing a revolution, just kill off everyone that doesn't agree with you, and you have fewer people, but you can re-educate them. Fortunately, I think for history, Vietnam opposed this and eventually led to the downfall of Pol Pot, and they conquered Phnom Penh, the capital. They were a successful communist revolution, but they'd never committed those kind of excesses. They'd fought off the Americans through bravery and courage, and they'd never, they couldn't relate to what Pol Pot's group had done to the Cambodian people themselves. There's a little footnote here: the psychology of violence seems to me often to do with self-violence. If peace comes from self-knowledge, war and violence comes, I think, from self-hatred, and somehow some of the Cambodians hated themselves enough to do this. Pol Pot hated the rich Cambodians and the aristocracy and the king, Sihanouk, and therefore wanted to massacre anyone that had any dealings with them or any degree of education. They were killed. So anyone vaguely middle class was killed or forced marched until they starved to death. That seems to me self-hatred. And I think what we're up against on the planet is an epidemic of self-hatred. The Cambodian thing's one example. I'd even say the Chinese thing is another. I think Mao's pathology was another form of self-hatred, because he was from a sort of reasonably well-to-do peasant middle-class family. And so I don't know, discuss what we do about self-hatred. It's the most, and I'm arguing it's the root of a lot of violence. Eventually the Vietnamese managed to eject him from power. But what's shocking is that he then lived on for another 15 years on the borders in the jungles, and America supported him. America gave aid to the remnant of Pol Pot's regime, in spite of all the horrors it had done, because they were anti-Vietnamese. So America, I think this is going back to my critique of American foreign policy, they constantly make the mistake of not doing the right thing. I mean, that's why I'm a believer in liberal democratic foreign policy. We look at stuff and we choose what's the right thing. And so did Labour under, Mr. Cook, who sadly died. Occasionally Labour does the right thing as well. And there is this tradition in British politics that we should have a foreign policy based on ethics. That was Robin Cook's idea. Whereas America doesn't seem to make the link between foreign policy and ethics. They have this idea that foreign policy is about power. Obviously it's about power, but it should be a power based on ethics. Otherwise you're on the wrong side of history. So I think those were the Kissinger years, by the way, and Kissinger specifically chose power over ethics, as in his support of Allende. So it's very complicated, but... And then the little vignette I wanted to share is that I've read detailed biography of Stalin over the winter, as well as the one of Mao. And when Mao went to Moscow to appeal to get the nuclear bomb from Stalin had him in a villa, Dasha, just outside Moscow, and he bugged it because he wanted to know what the guy was really thinking in his close circle. And then one of his Russian intellectual aides went in to talk to Mao, over the vodka. And at one point he asked him, what do you think of Marxism? What do you feel your Chinese Revolution has accomplished in terms of applying Marxist theory and stuff? And Marx, who'd had a couple of vodkas, said, I have to confess, I've never read a word of Karl Marx. Don't care, haven't got a clue. We're doing it our way. We're doing peasant revolt, and we just pretend it's a kind of Marxism. And that was picked up on the bugging device. And Stalin listened to that with his other aides, and they were shocked because, they're running, this is a fellow communist justifying his revolution in terms of Marxism, admitting he's never read a single word of Marx. And Stalin was shocked. He was also shocked when Mao got the bomb. He gave him the nuclear bomb, and in return for huge food transfers from China, which was starving, couldn't afford this, and Mao deliberately starved his own population to get the bomb. Again, lack of ethics. The bomb isn't a good idea, they shouldn't have got it, and certainly not. It cost something like 40 million Chinese deaths to get that nuclear bomb. And then when he got it, he frightened Stalin by saying, yeah, and I'm happy I'm going to use it now. And Stalin said, no, the whole point about the bomb is you shouldn't use it. It's dangerous because it leads to the destruction of your country too immediately. It's called, you just have it for deterrence, that's all. Mao said, no, I don't agree with that. No, China's different. We have a vast population, whereas America only has a small population. If we have a nuclear weapons war with them, we will win, because our immense population will be hiding in the caves of the mountains, and we will emerge at the end when they're all dead. And he was thinking like that he would win a nuclear war against America. Now, Stalin was shocked when he heard that, and some historians speculate that led to his final death. He had a stroke. He was so shocked that Mao was thinking of using the bomb. So I don't call any of this. I think poor old Marx, if he were alive today, he would look on what's been done in his name with horror, just as Christ would look in horror at what's been done in his name, or Muhammad, what's been done in his name. It raises difficult questions about who owns the copyright of ideas. They can call themselves Marxists, but they're not, in my opinion. And I'd like to also flag up another book I've been reading this week by a man called Mark Fisher, who I'd not heard of before. And my new guest was very enamoured of him. In a book called Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher was an interesting British academic and teacher who upgraded his sort of studies of what's wrong with capitalism up to the 2000s, and he invented the notion. So capitalist realism is to capitalism as socialist realism is to socialism, and it's a very interesting study. Unfortunately, he died before he did the main second volume, which was on philosophy, but it's well worth a read. And in my commentary on Das Kapital, I've been saying much of the same stuff that Mark Fisher says, but he's also a great, he was a teacher, and he resented having to, the way the bureaucracy stands on the back of teachers and insists on like monitoring everything we do. And Mark Fisher coined a great phrase for this, what is it, this sort of market Stalinism. Market Stalinism pretends to be capitalist, but actually is a form of Stalinism, because everything has to be accounted for. Also, the fact that the thing on paper may pass the censors, the reality is totally different. So teachers have to fill in all these forms, making it all look good, but actually, they just, in the real world, get on and teach stuff. And that's really what was going on in the Soviet Union. They were filling all the forms in to say they were successful, output was up, everyone was nobody was hungry. But the reality is they were all starving to death and output was falling. So they made apparently 2 copies of all the forms, the one for the officials, the communist checkers, and the other for themselves. And it's sort of got to the same point in late capitalism, says Mark Fisher, that we've got this market Stalinism at work. Anyway, some useful theoretical tools in that study. And I think Karl, if he were alive today, would be interested in seeing how he can update his own theories to take account of actual existing history. And the misuse that's been done in his name is shocking. Okay, any comments on that before I move on to the next one? Santeria. The other thing I will say is that Mark Fisher himself also in the book talks about mental health issues. And mental health issues are another feature of late capitalism. He talks about, and there's a sort of outbreak of mental health issues going on in the capitalist world. And it's become a sort of business, is Mark's point. So I won't say more about that, but it is worth reading. Right, let's go look at the next one. So this Santeria is a new religious movement, 103. And it seems to have been taken to the New World by slaves from Africa, from the Lukumi people, the Yoruba of Nigeria, from the 1800s when slavery was going on. And it's also called Lukumi or Candomblé. And they basically transplanted this Nigerian Yoruba religious idea into the slave colonies of Cuba and Salvador, Bahia, and Brazil, elsewhere in Latin America. So there are hymns and writings that have come down. It's an oral tradition. They believe in orishas, which are the spiritual deities and ancestor spirits that guide the people. And we know the names of some of these. Olorun is an important one. They're both male and female. And they also have temples with sacred altars. Tereros, they call them, temples, and outdoor shrines. It was forbidden and it was punished by the slave owners, but they did it in secret anyway in the woods, and they kept this thing going. And then after freedom from slavery, it came out of the woodwork. It's thought there are about 100,000 practitioners of Santeria, and about 500,000 of Candomblé, approximately. It's based on traditional African paganism and polytheism. And priests train as trance mediums who can contact these spiritual deities. Now that's interesting. In Europe, in Britain, we tend to segregate the religious functionary, the priest, from the medium, who's a different specialist. And people will maybe, I know people that will go to the medium if they want to contact the spirit world, but they'll go to the church and get the sacraments from the priest. Here, they combined the two. They believe the earth has a spiritual realm surrounding it, made of 9 semi-permeable concentric spheres, populated by these deities and the souls of the dead. Well, maybe it is. I mean, in Neoplatonic theosophy, there's a similar kind of idea. So in Greek paganism, which in its evolved form grew into theosophy, the spirits of the dead do inhabit either the underworld or the kind of etheric realms above the earth. And at the highest realms are populated by the gods. Seems to me that this African idea is exactly the same, pretty much. And I'm sure people have compared the two. They also have a supreme creator who's called Olorun. And each soul, so everyone has a deity that looks after us, a specific spiritual guide. And that's exactly the same as in Greek religion or Roman. We have a genius, which is the Roman word for it, who watches over us. The values and virtues it promotes are, this world is sacred and holy, and the gods created it for us to learn in. So it affirms this world, even though it's difficult sometimes, and we have terrible mistakes we make individually or collectively, and there are tragedies like, the Chinese Maoist invasion of Tibet and Pol Pot's killing fields and all that. We get over it, we win, we come through with the guidance of our spiritual deities. So ritual is important as a way of focalizing those energies of goodness. So prayers, songs, dances are important. And the dance is one way of bringing those energies into embodiment. Mediumship and seership are also important, based on truth and integrity. And musicality is part of the religion. So the festival, the feast, the dance, the celebration. I mean, this is universal language. Every culture loves that. Sexuality is sacred, shouldn't be misused, but when it's rightly used, it's a sacrament. It's a sacred thing. And mankind has to live in balance with nature because they too have their guardian deities. The fish, the birds, the trees, the foxes. I'm reading a book about a philosopher and his wolf at the moment. It's a true story of an American philosophy professor who had a pet wolf that he used to take into lectures. And it's a masterpiece of a little book. He trained his wolf. Can I borrow your cup for a minute? He trained his wolf to be able to go into the lecture and sit under his desk as he was teaching. This is the wolf cub. I knew a British woman once who trained with American Indian shamans, who taught me that the wolf is the teacher. In the wolf medicine, that's what teachers have. So it's amazing this philosopher actually had a full-on wolf. That's cool. So I'm learning about that at the moment. So nature is, and that wolf had its own, deity looking after it, as do all animals. My cat is obviously semi-divine and has her own little deity looking after her. So, so that's Santeria, and it's interesting. Yes. Any questions?
It sounds, like Dia de los Muertos in Mexico.
Yeah.
Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
It sounds almost similar to that, and the sort of Day of the Dead celebrations, in some regard. But I suppose it sounds similar to a lot of things.
Yeah, there's a universal repertoire that all these different religions draw on. I mean, the human condition is birth, conception, death. That's the sort of universal. They're like the instruments, but then each tribe plays a slightly different tune on that. The Day of the Dead, that's fascinating. I think it more draws on indigenous Mesoamerican customs going back to ancient times, Aztec and other cultures. But I'm sure that the African element, certainly in Brazil, is important.
But I wonder, it's interesting how you say it picked up a lot in Latin America. It's just fascinating how close it is too. Obviously I know it came from Nigeria, like you said, but it's just interesting.
Yes, and I mean, it's not really so much in Santeria, but in a related one, Santo Daime, they also use psychedelics as part of the sacrament. That's number 102, which is a big one also in Brazil. And they've sort of got this marriage of pagan, indigenous, American Indian plus Christianity, and they've created a kind of new sacrament of using psychedelics. It's like a folk Roman Catholicism in ritual. So, and we were discussing earlier about liberation theology in Latin America, which is about freeing people from oppression, including mental oppression, and also whether psychedelics can be part of that liberational process. I think in Santo Daime they are. I'm sure people in the Santeria and Candomblé tradition also use them in appropriate amounts. And in Africa there were native psychedelics in use, not just in Ethiopia but all over. They had a particular root they used to use, iboga and things.
And still do.
And still do, So I think every culture, has peeked through the apertures of the heaven world and seen spirits at work, and wants to understand how to manage that, how we should therefore live in that light. And going back to China, the reason I love the Taoists is they seem to have worked out quite a good system, which is leave it alone, the gods know what they're doing, it'll heal of itself. And so this idea of interfering and changing everything and having a revolution and making it all different and killing people is against that law of nature that, life itself wants goodness to flourish and will if it's left alone. And our duty is to just tend that process with a hands-on approach. Hands-off approach. So let nature take its course, a bit like the naturopath physician, rather than the one going in and giving lots of pills and medicines. So naturopathic philosophy is allowing them all to flourish and then, watching them as they go through their cycles. Yes, okay, well there we are. That's that's those two. That's very exciting. I think it's... Any questions about this?
No.
Okay. I will just say, I know we don't have time, but if we did, I'd do Sumerian. And I still want to crack the Sumerian language, which is in my 99 Names of Peace, because it's so interesting. And this book, just to go back to the Paradise Papers, I just quote here, somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200, another group of people appear to have entered Sumer. Professor Saggs writes of a temple in what is known as the Uruk period as indicating the arrival of a mountain race familiar with the techniques of stone working. And at this point, areas of Nippur and Kish begin to develop as population centres, and a god known as Enlil appears. In myths and inscriptions we read of Enlil as the bright-eyed great mountain, and his temple is described as the house of the mountain. Now, what I want to find out is A, where these people come from and where Sumerian came from. Was it related to other languages and traditions? Because it just sort of appears in history. And that will be very interesting, because in the 18th century, Jesuit priests that went to China said that Sumerian and Chinese were connected, and that the Sumerians had provided the first kings of China, like Yao. I don't know. I think what I would like to say is that if we all became Taoists and paid attention to the flow of life, we would pay more attention to the roots and origins of things, as Confucius asked us to do, and we would less fanaticize about what form of ritual garb we should wear or which kind of prayers we should do. We'd be much more interested in the substance, the essence of things. And then I think Sumerian will be cracked, and Etruscan, and all the other ancient wisdom traditions, and the original texts of the Druids that we hid as termers 4,000 years ago. We can find them in a cave in Wales somewhere. That's what I want, a world based on wisdom. Anyway, that's just a news flash. Let's look at our gods and see what they are up to. Because that's an exciting thing. Right. You shuffle up and choose one and then pass them on.
Izanagi,
Fine.
Japanese.
Okay, we'll have Japanese guy. Right.
Thank you.
Haven't had him for a while. Huh. Ah,
Sorry, I got that one.
have another one. We'll have a change. You've got Yahweh again, but we had him last week. We did him justice, I think.
That's weird.
Hmm.
Poseidon. We had Poseidon.
We had him as well, so let's...
I did shuffle that as well.
Sure. They sort of come in clusters, it's strange. Hmm.
Bell.
I'll tell you what, we'll do it slightly differently. I'll hold them out to you, and then you choose one. That's how it should be. Because you're getting the same ones. Yeah.
I was choosing randomly as well. I wasn't
I
just going.
I know, it's just weird, isn't it? Right, okay, let's try this way then. Fine.
Ah.
Saturn. Yeah. I mean, we had him recently as well, but so we've got two deities here. We've got Izanagi, which is the Shinto deity of creation, and is in the major arcana as the magician. So he plays the function role in Shinto, Japanese religion, as the magician that created the world that we live in. And so I love Shintoism. I've not been to Japan. I've not been to a Shinto temple, but I've studied it and I've had Japanese friends and I've watched videos of people going around them and things. The Shinto temples are interesting because they're never made of metal. They're made of wood and, there are no physical metal nails used. And even in busy downtown Tokyo, there are apparently patches of land that have never been built on, that have been, forest or kept apart. And those are the Shinto sanctuaries in every Japanese city. So basically, it's a nature religion. And they love their sky deities. There are 6 generations of sky deities that have created humankind. And Izanagi is, the most important, really, with his partner, because he can't